Good afternoon. It's Friday, the 21st of February 2020, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. Joining me today in the studio, Patrick Henningsen from 21st Century Wire. Welcome to the programme, Patrick.
Great to be with you, Mike.
And we're going to get started with Idlib, Patrick, and Turkey.
Well, this has been in the news. If you're looking at all the major international news, it looks like we're getting very close to a multinational confrontation in the province of Idlib. This is located in northern Syria. And apparently what has happened, a series of events which we outlined on last week's program, Mike, with regards to what is Turkey doing in Syria and how they're basically scraping up against their previously allied with Russia, but now it seems they've fallen back into the hands of Washington. Washington's been working very hard to pull Turkey back, and of course, as they're getting close to liberating one of the last terrorist strongholds of Idlib, Mike, we have Turkey basically throwing a spanner in the works and threatening to attack the Syrian army. And so a lot of people are right now talking about President Erdogan of Turkey and how he is creating many of these problems and will not let go of these territories that Turkey has been occupying and using its proxies to occupy. And if you look at the headline on this, this should be a cause for worry. Russian warplanes repel an attack on the Syrian army in Idlib as militants launch an offensive against the Syrian army, so by the Turkish artillery. So Turkey is backing up terrorists, essentially, and they're doing this now in an official fashion. Before they were kind of doing it, Mike, in the gray areas. So it's very dangerous because this could very easily cascade into fighting and draw the United States further into this conflict.
Well, indeed, and this was the subject of a Security Council debate on Wednesday afternoon, Patrick. Well, it was supposed to be a political update, but in fact they rolled this guy in, Mark Lowcock, who's the UN Undersecretary for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief, and he of course is a former Department for International Development civil servant, now working at the UN. And so what narrative do you think Lowcock was presenting to the Security Council? Well, it was this. 900,000 people are displaced in northwest Syria. People are living in the most horrific conditions. Young children are freezing to death. It's a humanitarian horror story. So he was talking about that at the Security Council conference, and in the meantime he was giving interviews to various media outlets around the world, basically carrying the same narrative. So as we might expect, Lowcock's narrative was jumped on by the UK and the US to denounce Russia, not least Karen Pierce, who with her usual flair used the word Russia many, many times. She said that Russia and Syria need to stop indiscriminate and inhumane attacks in Idlib that are killing and injuring innocent civilians. The Germans, who are temporarily on the Security Council until later this year, they got involved in it. And of course, they were calling for Security Council intervention. And this, of course, is what this is all about, Patrick. They're really starting to beat the war drums again, trying to build up an international coalition to involve themselves back in Syria. That war was lost. They're clearly not prepared to accept that loss, and they want to have another go at it. So they're using Idlib as the excuse. So the German ambassador to the UN saying, we have an immense responsibility that we face here as the United Nations, as the Security Council, to stop what is happening. The Russians, for their part, weren't having any of this. So here is their ambassador to the United Nations, Vasily Nebenzia, and he said, many countries give Russia advice on what to do and how to do it. For our part, we can also give a couple of recommendations. For example, he recommended that the West stop supporting Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which of course is a proscribed terrorist group. And he said, we've heard all of today's rhetoric on many occasions this month. You're playing the card of civilian suffering and long-term truce every time the terrorists you cherish are in danger. That's pretty strong words.
It is, but he's absolutely correct in his assessment, and you'll probably find, Mike, that he's actually not alone in this assessment.
Well, that's absolutely right, because here is Colonel Miles Kaggans, the military spokesperson on Operation Inherent Resolve. who was speaking to Sky this morning saying Idlib province seems to be a magnet for terrorist groups, especially because it's an ungoverned space in many ways. There are a variety of groups there. All of them are a nuisance, a threat, and a menace to the civilians. I don't think he's going quite far enough on what they represent to the civilians, but nonetheless, very interesting that a US official would be really admitting that this place is full of terrorists.
This is absolutely unbelievable, and I'm wondering why is this happening? So why is this happening? You're going to ask me why the change of script for the United States? Because before they were, we need to, save the civilians, and the rebels are there, and they just want freedom and democracy. They're flying the ISIS black flag in the background. Why is the U.S. spokesperson changing the script, Mike? This is the question, and the answer might be, Mike, that they're trying to normalize their position in order to possibly enter the fold in Idlib, possibly in coordination even with Russia, at least on a kind of a deconfliction agreement. They have done this before in other parts of Syria. So the U.S. needs to muscle in. It needs to be a stakeholder. As long as it's out of the airspace and frozen out of Idlib, this is what the United States fears the most, that they will not have a hand in sort of being at the table to organize and decide what is going to be the destiny of Syria. Right now, they're on the outside, and they want to get inside. So I look at this announcement by the Inherent Resolve spokesperson, Mike, as a first move to try to move back into that fold, somehow finesse their way in, Mike.
I mean, when we look, Patrick, at the mainstream media coverage of this, it's a very one-sided narrative that Syria and Russia are bombing civilians. There's nobody else in Idlib other than civilians.
And hospitals and schools.
Right.
There's thousands of hospitals in Idlib, apparently, according to mainstream reports.
Absolutely. So going back to what Vasily Nebenzia said, he went on to say, someone has said recently that international humanitarian law applies to all types of conflicts. He said, we therefore ask to put pressure on terrorists in Idlib and make them stop using civilians as human shields, stop the execution and torture of those who go into the street to oppose the invasion of terrorists, and give residents access to humanitarian exit corridors. That is an accurate comment, but it's never reported in British or US mainstream press.
And I'll add to that, what else is not reported is the fact that there are humanitarian and exit corridors, Mike. There are egress pathways that have been established by the Russian coordinators and by the Syrian government forces, but residents are being kept from entering those areas by the terrorists or the rebels. So there's only one option left. If they want to flee hostilities, Mike, it's to go to Turkey. And of course, Turkey is raising Cain that all these refugees are going to flood into our country. That's why we're in here. This is the main reason why Turkey says it's trying to sort of keep the peace inside Syria, is that they're trying to keep the refugees out of Turkey, Mike. But at some point, all of these, this juggling act that Erdogan is currently attempting to do, some of the balls are going to fall very quickly, very soon. But this is where the United States can come in and save Turkey, and then we have another protracted controversy and negotiations, ceasefire agreements, and so forth. You can kind of see where this might be going in the event that there's not going to be any fighting between the U.S. and Russia, for instance, or directly between Russia and Turkey, for instance. It's going to have to go to some sort of roundtable discussion. But it's a question of time. The further Syria moves forward to liberate their own land with Russia, the less of a chance that Turkey and the United States are going to have to try to muscle their way in and stall things, basically.
Okay, well, let's move on to this, because speaking of dropping balls, perhaps the British government has dropped a ball here, and the Middle East Eye has exposed that. This is a fantastic article, revealed the British government's covert propaganda campaign in Syria.
This is a feature that was published by Ian Cobain and Alice Ross. I was shocked, quite frankly, when I saw this story break this week, Mike, because Middle East Eye has been, very much a regime change. Some people might say it's got a Qatari orientation. So a lot of regime change coverage over Syria over the years. Very rarely will you find an honest assessment of what's really going on under the surface, especially with regards to British involvement. So let's take a look at what they're claiming here. This is a fascinating report. Okay, this is just one highlight here. They're talking about a British government, it looks like it's under the Foreign Office, to recruit contractors were recruiting citizen journalists in Syria, often without their knowledge, to help promote the, quote, moderate opposition and anti-regime propaganda, basically. So they were being steered and managed by these British contractors firms. I think there were 9 contracts given out, Mike, on this one. And here's a quote here. The reinforcement of popular rejection of the Assad regime and extremist alternatives, promotion of the moderate values of the revolution, promotion of Syrian national identity. So you can see the French mandate flag there, just on your right-hand side. The revolution will prevail. This is very much the rhetoric from the Syria campaign, from a lot of the online trolls that will be attacking outlets like UK Column or 21st Century Wire, and so forth. So let's move on to have a look inside here, because let me say, this is very, very revealing. So the requirement, this is from the contract specifications, the requirement for the selection, training, support, and mentoring of Syrian oppositionist media activists who share the UK's vision for the future of Syria. And they have their, see the guidelines there were attached, but will abide by a set of values that are consistent with UK policy, etc. And so we'll move on and see what else it says. Campaigns support the development and delivery of communication campaigns to bolster the values and reputations of the Syrian opposition. So this is absolutely incredible, and we'll move on here. Project purpose and objective. The purpose of this project is to support HMG, Syrian oppositionist grassroots media activism. This is to be a combination of human capacity building and assisting with the sustainment of delivery platforms capable of reaching Syrian audiences and so forth. So reinforcement of popular rejection of the Assad regime and extremist alternatives, promotion of Syrian national identity, etc. And so this is quite incredible. Furthermore, the UK audiences could on occasion be a specified target of this program, of some media being produced as part of the initiative with the permission of British officials in Istanbul.
So the Turkey connection once again.
Yeah, well, this was being run out of Istanbul and a couple of other locations, which are detailed in this article. The different strands of the propaganda program were evaluated by a scientist from the UK's Ministry of Defence looking for evidence of behavioral and attitudinal changes. Companies bidding for the contracts were told behavioral changes linked to campaign activity will be especially highly valued. So behavior modification, reframing, propaganda. This is a very sophisticated operation which was being run. This was launched right after the House of Commons vote on Syrian intervention in August 2013. Obviously, David Cameron's vote was defeated, so they didn't get authorization for military force. And after that, this program was initiated. So this is to ramp up the propaganda against the Syrian government and to sort of glorify or legitimize the moderate opposition, which we know was never moderate. And so it was extremist, and now it's developed into the monster that we're seeing in Idlib every day right now.
Well, that's an incredible report, and I would just like to remind everybody, of course, that this went back even further than 2013. This, in fact, goes back to before the Syrian war ever began. And here's Juliet Harkin, who is formerly BBC Media Action, who said that we, BBC Media Action, worked in 2004 with individuals within the Syrian ministry who wanted change and tried to get them to be the drivers of that. And she said, all media development work that has been done in Syria has, in my opinion, been predicated upon this idea that there can be change from within. You have an authoritarian regime and you find who the reformers are within that and you work with them. So that echoes everything that Middle East Eye has presented here. A separate operation, of course, but still the same kind of policy operation in place there. And the key point here, Patrick, is for me that, of course, last year the the UK government, with all the mainstream media, were pursuing a narrative that journalists had to be protected, particularly when they're in foreign countries. And the point that I was making was, I mean, I completely agree with that sentiment as far as it goes, but the point I was making at the time was, if you've got people working in a media capacity in foreign countries that are actually pursuing foreign policy, British foreign policy or US foreign policy, and they're arrested for that, and they're imprisoned for that, or in fact, in some cases worse, then you can't then stand up and shout, protect the journalists, because these guys aren't journalists. It puts real journalists at risk, because this is a Foreign Office operation.
Well, we can see from the evidence from this report. I mean, it's pretty thorough. I mean, it's an open and shut case in terms of the level of subterfuge that Western government would go to manipulate not only public opinion in the West, which we know about, but also to manipulate the local population. The U.S. has tons of these programs, by the way. Radio Free Syria. They've got transmitters right along the Turkish border. They're pumping in propaganda. Right today, you can go today in Syria and Aleppo, and you can catch some of these broadcasts. So they're radicalizing, and satellite TV, of course, does this as well. So it's almost impossible to escape this. There's dozens of Saudi channels that you can pick up, and they're have all the radical clerics on there, and down with the regime, and he's an infidel, and the apostates, and so forth. So it's no surprise that you have this sort of situation. British government, U.S. government, French government, they've all been intimately involved in building the media fifth column within Syria. And then those citizen journalists in Syria are then feeding information to CNN, to the BBC, to Channel 4, etc. And then white helmets also come through, that they were also promoting the Free Syrian Police. In this report, these same citizen journalists in Syria, and that's a British-funded operation.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's pretty damning, Mike, actually. But yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Now, if you like what the UK Column does and you would like to support us, then please head over to ukcolumn.org/community. There are various options for helping us out there. Your help much appreciated and much needed. And Patrick, we've got an event coming up in a couple of weeks.
Yes, the organizers of this event asked us to spread the word. MH17 awaiting trial. A lot of people aren't aware there's a big trial that's going to be taking place in The Hague, in the Netherlands, just in a few weeks. Okay, so this is a public meeting and a film screening of the film is MH17, A Call for Justice. This is by Bonanza Media. This is an excellent documentary film that is absolutely a jaw-dropper in terms of the evidence that's being presented here that is in stark contrast with the major Western narrative. And this is the intent of the organizers, to challenge the EU-NATO version of events surrounding the shoot-down of Malaysia Airlines flight MH17 in 2014. This is what this public meeting is going to be about, and there's going to be a number of guests there, Mike, and people presenting evidence, including a colonel from the Malaysian Army who was investigated on the ground in the Donbass, and also who picked up the black boxes. He'll be in attendance presenting, as well as an audio expert, and who's analyzing the Ukrainian Secret Service wiretapes that were used in the joint investigation teams, the Dutch-led teams, MH17 investigation. So it looks like a pretty stunning event, Mike, and it's going to be Tuesday, March the 3rd. If we go back and just show the details of that, Tuesday, March the 3rd, that's 2020, and this is 6:30 p.m. at Conway Hall in central London, Red Lion Square. And the organizers wanted to allow as many people to access this, so the entrance is free. They want people to come, they encourage people to come, and they're not charging entrance for this. This is a public meeting, Mike. So this is going to be a pretty stunning event. So if you're in London, I do think you should consider attending that. It's definitely going to be extremely interesting, and dare I say it, what's being presented might surprise quite a few people.
Okay, well, let's move on to something that probably will not surprise very many people, and that is that the UK, Georgia, and what they describe as international partners have exposed, well, who could it be that they've exposed for hacking a massive cyber attack on Georgia. Well, of course, they're claiming it's the GRU. Of course, this is Russia's military intelligence service. So they say that this cyber attack, amongst other things, knocked out more than 2,000 websites. And they say that in many cases, the websites' homepages were replaced with an image of the former Georgian president, Mikhail Saakashvili, and the caption, "I'll be back." So this information has come from the UK's National Cybersecurity Centre, which has assessed with the highest level of probability, not confidence, probability, that on the 20th of October 2019, the GRU carried out this large-scale disruptive cyber attack. These were against a range of Georgian web hosting providers, and they resulted in websites being defaced, as I said, and these included sites belonging to the Georgian government, to the courts, to non-governmental organisations, media and business, and also interrupted the service of several national broadcasters. This is part of, they say, Russia's long-running campaign of hostile and destabilising activity against Georgia. The UK is clear that the GRU conducted these cyber attacks in an attempt to undermine Georgia's sovereignty, to sow discord and disrupt the lives of ordinary Georgian people. And Dominic Raab butted in on this one. This is what he had to say. The GRU's reckless and brazen campaign of cyber attacks against Georgia, a sovereign and an independent nation state, is totally unacceptable. The rhetoric around this is very similar to the Novichok incident, Patrick, the way that they frame the language and so on. But what we are seeing here, I believe, is another example of the rapid response mechanism which Theresa May introduced at the G7 a couple of years ago, if you remember. This is attribution of blame and a common narrative right across the G7 nations.
And you're not allowed to challenge, once that common narrative has been decided, you are not allowed to challenge it. This is part of the rules of the rapid response mechanism amongst the allied countries, let's say.
Yes.
So those dastardly GRU operatives, they're smearing gel on doorknobs in Salisbury, and they're putting up screensaver pranks in the Republic of Georgia with Saakashvili's face on it, no less. Someone must be having a laugh somewhere, Mike.
Yes.
Maybe it's in Langley.
Well, maybe it is.
Using Vault 7 technology to leave Russian fingerprints, as was revealed in the WikiLeaks document dump a couple of years ago.
But it doesn't end there for the Russians.
Well, it is all about the Russians, and it is election season, Mike. So it's just a question of time. It's just a question of time before, well, it happened today. Elizabeth Warren, crazy Liz Warren, tweets, Russia is interfering in our election again to help elect Trump. So the primaries aren't even halfway through yet on the Democratic side, and they're already blaming the Russians. So after members of Congress were briefed about this threat, Trump fired the acting director of national intelligence. Trump is shredding our rule of law and the integrity of our democracy.
I don't think it's Trump that's doing that.
No, I don't think so. So, I mean, it's a high degree of probability. So Vladimir is just off to the side. He's having a little chuckle about this. What is Liz Warren referencing here? Well, it's this New York Times article here. Dare I call it an article? I'm not sure if it is. Lawmakers are warned that Russia is meddling to re-elect Trump. How exactly are they doing this? They're not very specific. They don't give any evidence, but there's just a feeling, apparently in the intelligence community, that Russia is working behind the scenes, although they can't say exactly how. But it's only a question of time, Mike, before the Democrats start blaming the Russians for Bernie Sanders' double-digit lead nationally, because they're in total meltdown right now. Mike Bloomberg just got hammered in his first debate. Joe Biden's on life support. Liz Warren is paddling out desperately on a raft that's drifting out to sea, watching her 13 points degrade away. And meanwhile, Bernie's surging. Go figure. So it's going to be very interesting. So they're going to blame the Russians. And so if they blame Bernie, they're going to have a slight problem, Mike, because if the Russians helped Bernie Sanders get the Democratic nomination, then Bernie's running against Trump. You know, is Russia going to back both candidates at that point? And then what happens? You know, can we blame Russia for both Trump and Bernie? Maybe. I don't know. Depends. But anyway, that's what's happening in the United States. So it's just absolutely hysterical. This is the political environment that we have in the United States right now. So this leads us to a very big story which was announced yesterday. The show trial of Roger Stone is finally over, and Roger Stone was sentenced to 40 months in federal prison.
That's significantly less than expected.
It was. The prosecutors were originally recommending 7 to 9 years, and the Department of Justice intervened, weighed in on this, and Trump was tweeting at the same time, so everybody was going wild out in all the different pockets of the, quote, resistance in the United States, saying, how dare Trump bear down as the executive on the judiciary? They're meant to be independent. Well, it turns out that the Department of Justice did that independently of Donald Trump before he started tweeting, and the judge appears to have agreed with the DOJ, and the sentence that was handed down is much less. However, Mike, Roger Stone should not be spending a day in prison, and this is one of the travesties of this particular story. We've detailed it very well here on 21st Century Wire, but you can also, there's a link to an RT feature which I wrote, which was on RT yesterday as a headline about the Roger Stone case, basically explaining that Roger Stone is being jailed for lying about having a back channel to WikiLeaks, when in fact there is no back channel to WikiLeaks. So he lied. He's being basically crucified for lying about something which
never happened.
Never happened. So there's no underlying crime, no basis for a criminal trial in this. So what they've done is all of the shenanigans that he's done in the meantime. He was breaking gagging orders. He was doing media stunts. They've added all these on as sort of infractions and process crimes. But what the important thing is, the last thing I'll say is the conviction of Roger Stone helps to keep the Russiagate, Russian-Trump collusion narrative it validates it basically. Because, you know, the whole premise of the underlying narrative is that the Russians hacked the DNC, handed the emails over to WikiLeaks, so therefore Julian Assange is in collusion with the Kremlin, he's an agent, so therefore WikiLeaks is a hostile foreign intelligence service, as Mike Pompeo calls it, and Julian Assange is a cyber terrorist. So Roger Stone's trial does the exact same thing as the U.S. extradition case against Assange. It reframes Assange and WikiLeaks. Without that, none of these convictions can be possible. None of these indictments would be possible because the Obama administration didn't actually do that. They wouldn't reframe and relabel WikiLeaks and Assange. This is why those indictments were not carried forward during 8 years of the Obama administration, because they weren't willing to go that far. However, Trump's Department of Justice is willing to invert reality and relabel and recategorize everything so that they can legally push it through. It is just the ultimate fraud of legalese. And it's a direct attack, basically bypassing the First Amendment. Roger Stone's case is the underlying framework of the assumptions, the prosecutorial assumptions in the Stone case is identical to the indictments that they put forward in the U.S. to extradite Julian Assange. So this leads us to, at the same time, while Stone is being sentenced, this story pops up, and this is the Daily Beast here. Trump offered Assange pardon if he covered up Russian hack, WikiLeaks founders' lawyers claim. So this is a story that came up during a pretrial hearing last Wednesday. One of Assange's defense, a QC, Ed Fitzgerald, I believe his name is, he basically said that Congressman Dana Rohrabacher from California, he's no longer in office, but in 2017 he visited Assange in the Ecuadorian embassy in London and offered that he would talk to Trump and ask for a pardon for Assange if Assange would give information about who hacked the DNC leaks, okay? And so this has been spun in the media, and let's look at, if you look closely on this headline, look on the corner and you see this, in red letters, quid pro quo.
So they're trying to somehow attach this to the whole quid pro quo scandal over Ukraine?
Exactly. So they're basically using this story. So the headline in this doesn't correspond at all to the story. So the claims being made in the headline, Mike, they're not actually in the body of the article. This is the same with The Independent and a lot of other outlets that ran with this story. So pure propaganda. And so the three important points of this story is, and I explain it here, at this article, which is up on 21st Century Wire. This is a long-form analysis if you want to get absolutely every detail of this angle of the story. So first thing is how it's spun by the media. So here it's being spun to demonize Trump and to keep the Russian hacking narrative alive, okay? And then how is this going to affect the trial? So this is actually the point of this, Mike, this Rohrabacher story is he did visit Assange, Mike, but the defense is, I believe, using this to show the extreme politicization of Assange's case. So it's very politicized. And this is just another example of that. So this is, what we're going to show is that they're meddling in the Assange case, well before the indictments were given, handed down. So there's meddling going on behind the scenes, and people. So immediately any objective judge would throw this case out immediately. But there is collusion between the U.S. and the U.K. to keep Assange on ice and possibly render him to the United States for a trial on extremely trumped-up charges. So, but the overall narrative management is important because. This is the last thing I'll say, Mike, is that the Rohrabacher came back and he made a statement, which is on his website, saying that Assange will give information if there's a pardon. So that's basically inferring that Assange is willing to give up his sources. And that knocks down the credibility of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. It's very subtle how this is played. So are there games going on? Is there a little bit of Are there politicians working the gray areas here on behalf of Washington, appearing to be independent? These are legitimate questions that we can ask in this. But any of these conspiracies that are floating out in the public sphere, that Assange is, willing to give up his sources or has divulged his sources to anybody, that's basically a knock against the credibility of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. But the stories are so juicy that they sort of float out there in the kind of conspiracy space. But people don't realize the underlying objective could be by the U.S. government is to discredit and to undermine the credibility of Assange and WikiLeaks as a journalistic outlet. And they're trying to reframe them as not journalists. So I'm looking at all these different angles. You can go and catch that up at 21st Century Wire.
Yeah, and in the meantime, John McDonnell's been getting into a little bit of trouble with respect to Julian Assange.
Well, here's the Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell, and he seemed to have put his foot in it, well, with one lobby anyway. So John McDonnell sparks Jewish fury by calling Julian Assange the Dreyfus case of our age and compares him to the Jewish French soldier who was falsely accused of treason by anti-Semites. And there's John McDonnell there, and he really caught the whirlwind here of the lobby, the Israeli and also the Jewish lobby. So he described the U.S. attempts to extradite Assange as the Dreyfus case of our age. He's comparing it with the case of Alfred Dreyfus. So that's historically he's correct because well, we'll go into that. So he is upset Karen Pollack here. She's the CEO of the Holocaust Educational Trust. Here's what she said. Dreyfus was a French artillery officer falsely accused of treason because he was Jewish. Go figure how or why John McDonnell could make such an inappropriate comparison with the Assange case. Outrageous, ridiculous, so deeply offensive was McDonnell's comments. Now, there was no intent by John McDonnell, clearly.
But it's got to be, nonetheless, he's got to be a little naive, bearing in mind everything that the Labour Party has received in terms of anti-Semitism narrative over the last 18 months.
Absolutely.
To try going down this road.
Absolutely, absolutely. I agree. But, poor John McDonnell. So we'll have another look at him here. So what's interesting is that the reason Dreyfus was exonerated, Mike, was because of a long campaign of many different people who came together to lobby for his release and his exoneration. That included intellectuals, artists, even Emile Zola, who wrote the famous J'accuse, based on this very case, okay? So, I mean, technically, John McDonnell has a kind of point there. That the campaign for Julian Assange is international, Mike. And look at what's happened. I'll show you what's happening tomorrow morning. Well, we have artists, intellectuals, lots of protesters coming from different countries to call for, to demonstrate for the release of Julian Assange, who's a political prisoner, according to many people. Okay, so it does have a lot of parallels with the Dreyfus case. Unfortunately, he stepped on the anti-Semitism button there, and the trapdoor was sprung for poor John MacDonald. So, but he'll be back on Monday.
Okay. Okay, well, let's move over to the EU now. And, they've been holding a special council meeting in order to decide the EU budget for the next 7 years. And the message out of that is that they need the Brits. So Merkel in particular very upset because they're very tough and difficult negotiations for this budget. I don't yet know, she said, whether this will be successful because we feel that our concerns have not yet been sufficiently taken into account in many places. So that draft budget was presented by Charles Michel, who is Donald Tusk's replacement. We will show that in a second, the details of that. And the draft budget is for 1.09 trillion euros. It's mainly driven by climate change and so on, and sustainable projects. They've 300 billion euros extra for sustainability. So let's have a look at what they're up to here. In order to achieve their sustainability, they're going to cut the Common Agricultural Policy by 14%. They're going to cut the Cohesion Fund. This is the fund that goes to the less well-off countries of Europe. They're going to cut that by 12%. They're going to create a climate protection fund of 260 billion euros. They're going to create a border patrol and give that 21.9 billion euros. Here's the best one yet, Patrick, common defence. They're going to get 14.3 billion euros for that. That's a rise of 635%. Now, you've got to understand this is not about defence budget because the EU at this point doesn't have an army. We've got to keep pushing this point. It doesn't have an army. So national defence budgets haven't changed. They're still spending their money on defence. This is the beginnings of the common defence institutions, which are now getting, instead of 2 billion euros, 14.3 billion euros. This is a very clear indication of where the EU sees EU defence going not as a nation, but as a pan-national defence force. So 14.3 billion euros.
But to me, the figure just above that, Mike, is more interesting. 21.9 billion euros for border patrol. Okay, so where's the EU border patrol? What wing is that going to be falling under? Probably
EU defence, absolutely.
So they've already allocated, according to this, Mike, not just for central command, as you said, for common defence, but also border patrol. 22 billion.
Yes,
has already been thrown in there. So yeah, so it seems like the money is already starting to move on this project. So.
But Angela Merkel making it clear that she's pretty unhappy about the lack of money coming from the UK because of Brexit. Of course, that's not clear yet because the future relationship deal has to be done, and also Britain's involvement in that new common defence institutions that still has to be agreed.
And just before we go, Mike, I want to make one point. Foreshadowing our next story. The third one is interesting to me. Climate Protection Fund, 260 billion euros. So my question is, look at that figure and tell me, Mike, how many degrees is that going to be worth on the thermometer? How many degrees will the temperature drop for 260 billion? Will we get a tenth of a degree, 1 degree, 1 degree over 20 years, half a degree over 50 years? Can anybody do an analysis and provide us with some feedback? Because wouldn't you want to know what you're going to be getting for your money if it's a quarter of a trillion euros, Mike?
Well, you might expect that, of course, but of course the EU doesn't have any audited accounts in certain areas, so they maybe aren't too worried about it. They really want to spend that money and push their new Green Deal. This is Ms. von der Leyen's one of her key things for her term as the President of the European Commission. I would imagine that £260 billion budget will be blown very quickly and they'll end up spending quite a bit more.
What's the 323 billion on cohesion fund? What's that about? Is that about keeping Europe
No,
together?
Well, the cohesion fund is money which goes, as I say, to the less well-off countries. So Ireland would have been in receipt of quite a lot of cohesion fund money over the years, and other of the less the not France, Germany, or UK countries would have received quite a bit of that.
Greece and Portugal,
Yes.
for instance.
So
yeah.
basically, what they're saying is we're going to take away the money that supports the less well-off countries and going to divert that into the green agenda, which is going to, of course, cause more pain to the countries that need the support.
Yeah, and what sort of pain? Well, our next story might give us a clue on that, Mike.
Well, absolutely, because of course last week, as we mentioned, the UK government announced, Ofgem rather, announced that the UK government would be producing a policy later in the year on home heating, domestic heating, and we were going to be removing gas boilers from the domestic heating situation. So not only gas boilers, we're going to be removing wood-burning stoves as well. These are banned. They're not banned, of course. What they're doing is banning the fuel that you burn in them, so that they effectively become ornaments in the corner of the room. Well, this is because of the claim that wood-burning stoves and coal fires are the single largest source of the pollutant PM 2.5, emitting twice the contribution of industrial combustion and 3 times the contribution of road transport. So apparently 2.5 micrometer particulate matter is much more from wood-burning stoves than it is from all the diesel traffic in the UK.
I don't believe that for a second.
I think you might be right about that. But anyway, just to make the point here, this is a graphic from a government document, which strangely enough is no longer available on the internet. That's been taken down.
It is now.
Yeah, well, it has been. And this is showing the annual emissions from PM10 and PM2.5 in the UK from 1970 to 2017. Well, we've made some pretty good progress in that time already. Apparently, that's not enough. We've got to continue.
So what you're saying is, they're already on the decline, Mike. It's already an extreme minority of home users with this type of old way of heating, right? So there's no need to do a complete ban. It's punishing people who live in rural areas, farmers, and people like this, right?
Yeah, yes, and they're justified by saying that, of course, this is a problem in cities. Now, of course, people who have wood-burning stoves in cities aren't using them to heat their homes. They're there to provide a nice fire once in a while, perhaps.
For Christmas.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what's this really about? Well, of course, you can't attach a wood-burning stove to a smart meter. So, you know, the pressure, the direction of travel here, it very clearly is that people will be taken off coal, gas, and wood and put onto electricity. So the electrical grid is going to become the only source of energy for domestic heating and for domestic power.
So if they decide that the price is going to be going up 25 or 30%, you don't really have any other alternatives, do you?
Absolutely, absolutely. So here is George Eustace, the Environment Secretary, and he said, "Cosy open fires and wood-burning stoves are at the heart of many homes up and down the country, but the use of certain fuels means that they are also the biggest source of the most harmful pollutant that's affecting people in the UK, so they've got to get rid of them."
What is
So
it, is
there
it
you
killing
go.
people, or how is it affecting people?
They say it's killing people. They say that that 30,000 people a year die from PM 2.5 from the results of inhaling PM 2.5 pollution. They can't obviously specify where that pollution has come from. So, for example, if people are dying from PM 2.5, is that because they've been walking along the street with diesel cars and vehicles beside them, or is it because they've been standing outside a house that's been burning wood in a wood-burning stove? They can't obviously know the answer to that question. They can only know the contribution, but nonetheless, they claim 30,000 deaths. It's not clear how many of these people that have died from the types of illnesses that they're blaming on PM 2.5 were also smokers, or also have other lifestyle.
Or living in a city that has much more sort of daily emissions,
Right.
and things like that.
So it's not clear, and it looks to me very much like, as I say, this is an effort to get people onto the electricity grid. no options other than the electricity grid.
A complete monopoly on how you're going to heat. This just going to be left with very few options, Mike. If the market decides that power is going to cost 40% more.
I mean, and
years.
we actually reported this last week, Patrick, at a village in Scotland where they've been piloting everybody on electricity, and the people there being forced onto food banks because basically the price of their heating went up by 40 or 50% as soon as they went on this new scheme.
So maybe they could distribute to help mitigate the problem. Last thing I'll say, Mike, is they could maybe distribute copies of With Nell and I, that film, as a kind of instruction of how to cope with how to heat with no money, where Richard E. Grant and his roommate were rubbing deep heat and Tiger Balm all over them, standing next to a drip drip radiator, trying to stay warm in the winter. Maybe back to basics.
Back to basics.
Is that what's on offer? Who
Could
knows?
well be. Well, look, on that note, we will leave it for today. Thank you very much for joining me, Patrick. Thank you for joining us. Have a good weekend. We will be back at the same time as usual on Monday, 1 p.m. See you then. Bye-bye.